Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere that will make your heated blanket feel like the single greatest invention in the history of human civilization. We are going to Yakutia, a vast, silent, bone-cracking region in the northeastern corner of Russia, where the cold is not merely a weather condition but an active, breathing presence that the land itself seems to exhale. Picture this. You step outside, and the moisture in your breath does not drift away in a little cloud. It freezes instantly and falls to the ground in a faint, crystalline whisper. The locals have a name for this phenomenon. They call it the whisper of the stars. You probably won't survive your first 10 minutes out there without the right gear, the right knowledge, and honestly, the right ancestry. And yet, people have not only survived in Yakutia for thousands of years, they have laughed, loved, told stories, raised children, and built entire civilizations on top of ground that never, not once, thaws more than a few feet down. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment below telling me where you are in the world right now and what time it is locally. Are you tucked up in a warm bed in Melbourne at midnight? Commuting in London at 7 in the morning? Let me know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing, in your mind at least, at the edge of a place called the Pole of Cold. Not the North Pole, that is a different kind of cold entirely, a maritime, windswept, oceanically mediated cold. This is something stranger and, in many ways, more extreme. This is a continental cold, a landlocked cold. The cold of a vast interior basin where Arctic air pools and settles like water in a bowl, growing denser and more savage with every passing night of winter. The town of Oymyakon, nestled in a river valley in the Oymyakon district of the Sakha Republic, which is the formal modern name for what we are broadly calling Yakutia tonight, holds the record for the lowest naturally occurring temperature ever recorded in a permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. On the 2nd of February, 1933, a Soviet meteorologist named Sergei Abrachev recorded a temperature of -71.2 degrees Celsius. That is -96.1 Fahrenheit, for those of you keeping score in the old system. To put that in perspective, the average temperature on the surface of Mars hovers around -60 degrees Celsius. Mars, the planet. Oymyakon was colder than Mars on that particular February morning, and there were people there going about their day. Now, before you decide this is simply a quirk of geography, a freakish anomaly that has no bearing on real human life, consider the scale of the Sakha Republic itself. It is the largest federal subject of Russia, covering over 3 million square kilometers. That makes it larger than India, larger than Argentina. If the Sakha Republic were a country, it would be the 8th largest in the world. And virtually all of it sits in the grip of a subarctic or Arctic climate so severe that the ground beneath it has been frozen solid for tens of thousands of years. This frozen ground, the permafrost, extends in some areas to depths of over 1.5 kilometers. 1.5 kilometers of frozen earth, unthawed since the last ice age or before, packed with ancient ice lenses, long-dead megafauna, and an eerie, preserved stillness that scientists are only beginning to fully understand. The capital city, Yakutsk, is the largest city built on continuous permafrost anywhere on the planet. With a population of around 300,000 people, it is a genuine, functioning metropolis. There are universities, theaters, shopping malls, traffic jams at rush hour, teenagers arguing about music, all of it happening in a place where January temperatures routinely fall to -40 or -50 degrees Celsius, and where the infrastructure challenges posed by building on frozen ground are so significant that entire fields of engineering have evolved just to address them. Pipes cannot be buried underground because the ground is frozen. Buildings cannot have conventional foundations because the heat from the building would melt the permafrost beneath it and the structure would slowly sink and tilt. Every single aspect of civil infrastructure that you take completely for granted in your town or city has had to be fundamentally reinvented here. And yet, here is what will keep you gently awake just a little longer tonight, turning this over in your mind. The people of Yakutia do not generally describe their homeland with horror or resignation. They describe it with pride. A deep, quiet, almost defiant pride that is rooted in thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, cultural memory, and what can only be called an intimate relationship with cold that goes so far beyond anything most of us will ever experience that it begins to feel almost like a spiritual practice. The cold, in Yakutian cultural consciousness, is not the enemy. It is the condition of existence. It is the medium through which life happens. To understand how this pride was forged, you have to go back, way back, to the geological and climatic forces that created this landscape in the first place. The Sakha Republic sits in the northeastern corner of the Asian continent, bounded by mountain ranges to the south and east that act as walls, trapping cold air in the interior lowlands. The Lena River, one of the great rivers of the world, longer than the Congo, draining a basin larger than Europe, flows northward through the region and empties into the Laptev Sea above the Arctic Circle. In winter, the Lena freezes so solidly that it becomes a highway. Trucks drive on it. And not small trucks, we are talking about heavy freight vehicles carrying tons of supplies to remote communities that have no road access when the ice is gone. The river, in winter, is literally more useful than it is in summer, because it becomes solid infrastructure. Think about that the next time you complain about a pothole. The climate is classified as subarctic, with some of the most extreme seasonal temperature variation on Earth. Winters that plunge to -70 are followed by summers that occasionally push past 35 degrees Celsius. The same ground that kills you in January can, in July, feel almost Mediterranean, if you squint and ignore the mosquitoes, which in summer arrive in such biblical numbers that they have driven both animals and unprepared humans to the edge of madness. Historians still argue whether the summer insect plague or the winter cold posed the greater historical barrier to human settlement in this region. But the mosquitoes of Yakutia deserve at least an honorable mention in any serious conversation about extreme survival challenges. They are, by all accounts, genuinely diabolical. The landscape itself is a thing of austere, overwhelming beauty. In winter, the forests of larch and pine, adapted to the permafrost in ways that most trees elsewhere in the world simply are not, stand bare and silver against skies that range from the pale, milky blue of an iron-cold noon to the absolute, velvety blackness of a polar night blazing with the aurora borealis. The northern lights here are not the faint green shimmer you might catch from Scotland or Scandinavia on a good night. In Yakutia, in deep winter, the auroral displays can be so vivid, so layered in greens and purples and flickering whites, that the snow-covered landscape below them seems to pulse with reflected light. People who have seen this describe it as one of the most disorienting and beautiful things a human eye can witness. A sky that appears to be alive. Below that sky, the frozen land holds secrets in extraordinary abundance. Yakutia's permafrost is one of the great natural archives of deep time. Preserved within it are the remains of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, ancient horses, and other megafauna that vanished from the earth between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago. These are not fossils in the traditional sense, compressed, mineralized remnants of bone. These are often actual physical bodies, still possessing flesh, fur, and in some cases internal organs, preserved by the cold as efficiently as anything a modern freezer could manage. Mammoth calves have been recovered with their last meals still visible in their stomachs. The scientific implications of this are enormous, and the cultural implications for the people who have lived alongside these frozen giants for millennia are equally fascinating. But we will come back to that. For now, let your imagination settle into the landscape. You are somewhere vast and white and cold and impossibly old. The air is so dry that your skin begins to tighten within minutes of exposure. Your nose hairs freeze. The exposed metal of any object you are foolish enough to touch without gloves will pull the skin from your fingertips with the efficiency of a trap. Sound behaves differently here. The cold makes the air denser, and in certain conditions sound carries with a strange, flat clarity, while in others the silence is so complete and so deep that you become aware of sounds you would never otherwise notice. Your own heartbeat, the creak of the ice beneath you, the faint structural groan of a frozen tree expanding in the night. This is not a place that forgives carelessness. Every single survival technique, every item of clothing, every architectural choice, every cultural practice and culinary tradition that you are going to learn about tonight was developed through a process that was, at its most direct, a matter of live or die. The people who got things wrong did not leave descendants. The people who got things right passed down their knowledge with a fidelity and seriousness of purpose that makes the resulting body of survival wisdom one of the most sophisticated and elegant responses to environmental extremity that human culture has ever produced. And that is what tonight is really about. Not just the cold, though the cold is extraordinary enough on its own. It is about the human response to the cold. The ingenuity, the stubbornness, the humor, the spiritual creativity, and the sheer, bloody-minded refusal to concede defeat that allowed people not just to survive in Yakutia but to build a culture there so rich and so specifically adapted to its environment that it stands as one of the most remarkable human achievements in history. You are going to learn things tonight that will change the way you think about cold, about survival, about what human beings are capable of. And if everything goes according to plan, you are going to drift off to sleep somewhere in the middle of it, warm and grateful and quietly astonished. So pull the blanket up a little tighter. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. The temperature outside Oymyakon tonight is probably somewhere around -50, and the stars overhead are so cold and so clear that they look like chips of ice themselves. But you are here, and you are warm, and we are just getting started. The Sakha Republic's sheer geographic scale creates microclimates that vary dramatically even within its own borders. The northern coastal zones along the Laptev and East Siberian seas are influenced by their proximity to Arctic Ocean air and tend towards somewhat milder extremes. If -40 can be called mild, which in this context, with absolute sincerity, it sometimes is. The interior river valleys and basins, however, trap cold air with ruthless efficiency. Cold air, being denser than warm air, flows downhill and pools in low-lying areas exactly as water does. The Oymyakon Valley is a perfect cold trap, surrounded by higher terrain on most sides. The cold air drains into it and accumulates, night after night, growing progressively more intense as winter deepens. The sun, during the depths of winter, barely clears the horizon even on its best days, providing almost no warming energy. From mid-November to late January, the sun at Oymyakon is a rumor more than a presence. A brief, orange smear along the southern skyline that appears for perhaps 3 hours casts long, theatrical shadows across the snow, and then disappears again as if it has simply given up. The permafrost underlying all of this is not merely frozen soil in the way that your garden might freeze during a hard winter. It is ancient, structural, geologically significant ice and frozen earth that has been in a continuous frozen state in some areas for hundreds of thousands of years. It exists in a delicate thermal equilibrium, cold enough to stay frozen, but not infinitely resilient. The active layer, the topmost section of ground that actually thaws each summer, ranges from a few centimeters in the coldest and most barren areas to perhaps a meter or two in more sheltered or vegetated zones. Below that, the permafrost begins and continues downward for depths that vary from a few dozen meters near the southern fringes of the permafrost zone to more than 1,500 meters in the coldest northern areas. Within this permafrost are found ice wedges, vertical formations of pure ice that grow incrementally over centuries as meltwater infiltrates cracks and refreezes, and pingos, dome-shaped hills formed by the pressure of freezing groundwater, lifting the overlying soil into rounded mounds that can reach 30 meters in height. The landscape of permafrost country is never entirely flat or featureless. It is alive with the slow, millennial drama of ice. All of this, the extreme temperatures, the permafrost, the dramatic seasonal variation, the immense distances, the river systems, the mountain ranges, forms the physical stage on which the human story of Yakutia has unfolded. And that story is far longer, far richer, and far more complex than the cold alone might suggest. To understand it properly, you need to go back to the very beginning, to the first human footsteps on this frozen ground, and to the extraordinary question of why anyone would have followed those footsteps at all. The first humans to enter what is now the Sakha Republic did not arrive with a plan. They did not consult a map, hold a committee meeting, or decide collectively that the northeastern corner of the Asian continent looked like a promising place to settle down and raise a family. They arrived the way most of humanity's great migrations happened, gradually, incrementally, following animals, following water, following the slow press of necessity and curiosity that has always been the engine of human movement across the earth. And they arrived, in geological terms, astonishingly early. The archaeological evidence for human presence in northeastern Siberia stretches back at least 30,000 years, and some sites suggest occupation considerably older than that. Historians still argue whether the earliest inhabitants of this region were a single population moving through from further west and south, or whether multiple waves of different human groups arrived at different times via different routes, each leaving their genetic and cultural imprint on the region before being absorbed, displaced, or transformed by those who came after. What the archaeology does confirm, with increasing clarity as new sites are excavated and new dating techniques applied, is that the human relationship with this extreme environment is not a recent or desperate improvisation. It is ancient, deliberate, and deeply rooted. You have to imagine the landscape of 30,000 years ago to appreciate what those first arrivals were walking into. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, had not yet arrived. The climate was cold, certainly, but it was not the same configuration of cold that exists today. Large parts of what is now the Arctic Ocean floor were dry land, exposed by the dramatically lowered sea levels of a world with vastly more water locked up in continental ice sheets. The land bridge connecting Asia and North America, Beringia as scholars call it, was not a narrow crossing but an enormous landmass in its own right, hundreds of kilometers wide, supporting plant life, animal life, and human populations. People moved across it in both directions over tens of thousands of years, and the northeastern corner of Siberia was the gateway. The environment these early inhabitants encountered was what paleoecologists call the mammoth steppe, a vast, cold but relatively dry grassland ecosystem that supported extraordinary quantities of large animals. Woolly mammoths, obviously, but also woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, giant deer with antlers spanning 3 meters, wild horses, bison, and reindeer in numbers that would seem almost impossible to modernize accustomed to the relatively sparse megafauna of today's world. This was a hunter's paradise, in the most literal and consequential sense. The caloric density available in a single mammoth, the fat, the protein, the marrow-rich bones, was sufficient to sustain a small human group for weeks. Hunting these animals was dangerous, demanding extraordinary coordination and courage, but the payoff was enormous. And the people of the late Paleolithic were not, it bears emphasizing, primitive in any meaningful cognitive sense. They were anatomically and neurologically modern humans, as intelligent and creative as anyone alive today, applying that intelligence and creativity to the specific and demanding problem of surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their tools reflect this sophistication. Archaeological sites across northeastern Siberia have yielded stone tools worked with a precision and intentionality that speaks to long traditions of craft knowledge passed down through generations. Needles made from bone, small, finely worked with carefully drilled eyes, tell us something particularly important. These people were sewing. And not just sewing in a rough, utilitarian way. The existence of bone needles this fine suggests the creation of tailored, fitted clothing with sewn seams, the kind of garments that actually trap body heat effectively rather than simply draping a skin over the shoulders. Without fitted, sewn clothing, survival at the temperatures of northeastern Siberia is essentially impossible for any extended period. The bone needle is, in this context, one of the most important technological artifacts in the entire history of human survival. Fire, of course, was equally critical, and the evidence for controlled fire use in the region is consistent with broad patterns of human occupation across northern Eurasia during this period. Hearths have been found at archaeological sites, some of them showing repeated use over long periods, suggesting semi-permanent or regularly revisited camps rather than purely nomadic wandering. The construction of shelters using mammoth bones, great curving ribs and tusks arranged to support coverings of hide, is documented at sites across the Mammoth Steppe Zone. And while the most elaborate of these bone structures come from sites further west in what is now Ukraine, the principle of using the bodies of the very animals you hunted as building material is one that recurs throughout the archaeological record of this entire vast region. You killed a mammoth and then, in a sense, you lived inside it. There is something almost poetic about that, and also something extremely practical, since in an environment where timber might be scarce or difficult to work, mammoth bone was a readily available and structurally useful building material. The genetic story of who these people were and how they relate to later and modern populations is one of the most actively researched and debated areas in the entire field of ancient DNA studies. Ancient genomic analysis, the extraction and sequencing of DNA from ancient human remains, has revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric population movements across Siberia and northeastern Asia over the past decade. What has emerged is a picture of remarkable complexity. There was not one founding population that simply stayed put and gave rise to all later inhabitants. There were multiple populations, mixing and separating over tens of thousands of years, some of them representing lineages that no longer exist in unmixed form anywhere in the modern world. One particularly intriguing ancient Siberian population, known to geneticists as the ancient North Eurasians, contributed genetic material to an enormous range of later populations spanning from Western Europe to the Americas. A ghost population of enormous historical significance whose precise identity and homeland remain subjects of active research and genuine scholarly excitement. By around 10 to 15,000 years ago, as the last glacial maximum receded and the climate began its slow warming toward the relatively mild conditions of the Holocene, the geological epoch we still inhabit today, the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem began to collapse. The precise cause of this collapse is itself one of the great unresolved debates in quaternary science. Was it primarily climate-driven, as warming and increasing moisture transformed the cold, dry grasslands into the wetter tundra and boreal forest that cover the region today? Or was it primarily human-driven, as increasingly efficient hunters reduced megafauna populations faster than they could reproduce? The most likely answer is some combination of the two, with different species and different regions weighted differently. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, and most of the other great mammals of the mammoth steppe were gone, and the human populations that had depended on them had to adapt or perish. This was a profound and transformative pressure, and the populations that came through it were shaped by it in ways that echo through the entire subsequent history of the region. Subsistence strategies shifted. Where large game hunting had been the dominant mode of obtaining calories, fishing became increasingly important. The great rivers of Siberia, as the climate warmed and stabilized, supported enormous runs of salmon, sturgeon, and other species that could be harvested in quantity and preserved through drying and freezing. Reindeer, which survived the end Pleistocene extinction event in healthy numbers, became the central large mammal in the subsistence economy of many northeastern Siberian groups, hunted wild at first and eventually, in a process that unfolded over thousands of years across the circumpolar north, domesticated and herded. The reindeer is to the peoples of northeastern Siberia what the cow is to the agrarian civilizations of temperate Eurasia, the central, multifunctional animal around which an entire way of life is organized, providing meat, fat, hide, bone, sinew, milk, and, in its domestic form, the power to carry loads and pull sleds. The groups who inhabited the Yakutian region in the millennia following the end of the last ice age were ancestors of the peoples known today as the Yukagir, the Evenki, the Ivan, and other Tungusic and Paleo-Siberian-speaking populations. These are among the oldest continuous inhabitants of northeastern Siberia, their languages and cultures representing traditions that stretch back in the region for thousands of years. The Yukagir, in particular, are sometimes described by linguists and anthropologists as one of the most ancient surviving cultural and linguistic traditions in all of northern Eurasia, a people whose way of life, before the disruptions of later historical periods, was so finely and specifically adapted to the Yakutian environment that it represents an almost unparalleled example of long-term human ecological specialization. Their knowledge of the land was, and in many communities remains, encyclopedic in its depth and specificity. Not just general knowledge of the kind of animals present or the approximate location of rivers and hills, but the kind of granular, season-specific, microhabitat-level knowledge that can only be accumulated over generations of careful observation and transmitted through equally careful oral tradition. Which bend of which river holds fish at which depth in which month? Which slope catches enough sun to melt slightly earlier in spring, exposing the first green growth that will attract reindeer from kilometers away? Which patterns of wind and cloud and frost predict what kind of weather will follow in the next 12 to 48 hours? This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in the minds and bodies of the people, transmitted through story, through practice, through the patient watching of elders and the eager imitation of the young. Losing a single knowledgeable elder to an early death was not merely a personal tragedy in these communities. It was a genuine information catastrophe. The spiritual dimensions of this knowledge are impossible to separate from its practical dimensions, and we will return to this theme at much greater length when we explore Yakutian shamanic traditions later tonight. For now, it is enough to note that for the ancient inhabitants of Yakutia, the boundary between what we would call natural knowledge and what we would call spiritual understanding was not a boundary at all. The river held fish because the river had a spirit, and the spirit of the river had its own preferences, moods, and requirements. The reindeer came to certain places because those places were significant in a world of meaning that extended far beyond the merely physical. Hunting successfully was not purely a matter of skill and timing. It required right relationship with the beings of the land, maintained through correct ritual behavior, respectful disposal of animal remains, and the intercession of specialists, shamans, who could navigate the relationships between the human world and the spirit world with a fluency that ordinary people could not achieve. This is not naive animism in the dismissive sense that earlier Western anthropologists sometimes applied to indigenous belief systems. It is a sophisticated, internally consistent cosmological framework that served real social and ecological functions, regulating hunting pressure, distributing resources, managing conflict, and binding communities together through shared ritual and shared meaning. The fact that it is also deeply beautiful, rich in narrative complexity, and expressed through some of the most extraordinary oral literature and visual art in the circumpolar world is, perhaps, not a coincidence. Extreme environments demand not just physical adaptation but psychological and spiritual resources of the deepest kind. As the centuries and millennia rolled forward, the human landscape of what would become Yakutia continued to shift and layer. New groups moved in from different directions, bringing new languages, new technologies, new animals, new ideas. The Tungusic-speaking peoples, ancestors of the modern Evenki and even, spread across an enormous swath of northern and central Siberia, bringing with them sophisticated reindeer herding traditions and a mobility-based way of life that allowed them to exploit the boreal forest environment with remarkable efficiency. They moved with their herds through seasonal circuits that might cover hundreds of kilometers, their lightweight, portable material culture perfectly adapted to a life in motion. And then, sometime in the second millennium of the Common Era, the details are debated, the precise timeline uncertain. A new group arrived from the south, from the region around Lake Baikal, bringing with them horses and cattle and a language that was Turkic in its roots. These were the ancestors of the Saka people, who would go on to become the dominant cultural and linguistic group in the region and give their name, eventually, to the Saka Republic itself. Their arrival, and their extraordinary adaptation of a southern pastoral lifestyle to one of the coldest environments on Earth, is the next remarkable chapter in this story. The Saka people's arrival in Yakutia is one of the more improbable stories in the entire history of human migration, and it bears sitting with for a moment before you let your eyes get too heavy. Imagine, if you will, a group of people whose entire cultural identity is built around horses and cattle, warm-steppe animals, animals that evolved on open grasslands under relatively generous skies, deciding or being forced by circumstances to take those animals north. Not just a little north. Not into the merely chilly northern steppe where the grass still grows thick and the winters are merely unpleasant. All the way north into the boreal forest, into the permafrost zone, into a world where winter temperatures regularly fall below -50 degrees Celsius and where the ground never fully thaws. This is the equivalent of someone deciding to relocate their beach resort to the surface of the moon and then, against all probability, making it work. The Saka, known historically in Russian sources as the Yakuts, a name that most scholars believe derives from a Tungusic term for the group, though the people themselves have always called themselves Saka, are believed to have originated in the region around Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, where they were part of a broader cultural and linguistic zone of Turkic-speaking pastoral peoples. Sometime between the 10th and 14th centuries of the Common Era, and historians still argue whether this migration was primarily voluntary, driven by the search for new pastures, or primarily forced, driven by pressure from other groups to the south, possibly including the expansion of Mongol power across Central Asia. The Saka began moving northward along the great river systems, particularly the Lena, which served as a highway into the interior of northeastern Siberia. What they brought with them was a pastoral economy centered on two animals, the horse and the cattle breed now known as the Yakutian cattle. Both of these animals underwent, over the subsequent centuries, a process of adaptation to the Yakutian environment so dramatic that they are today considered distinct from their southern relatives in ways that go beyond mere appearance. The Yakutian horse is a genuinely remarkable creature. Stocky, heavily muscled, covered in a coat so thick and dense that it can withstand temperatures that would kill most other domestic horse breeds within hours. These horses do not need to be stabled in winter, and this is not a minor convenience. It is a fundamental economic and logistical advantage, because building and heating structures large enough to shelter horses through a Yakutian winter would be prohibitively expensive in fuel and labor. Instead, the Yakutian horse does what no other horse breed on Earth is reliably documented to do. It forages through the snow in winter, using its hooves to break through the ice crust and reach the dried grass beneath, a behavior called cratering. The horse essentially feeds itself through the worst winter on the planet by doing something that its southern cousins would not attempt and could not manage. It is as if the horse decided, upon arrival in Yakutia, that it would simply become a different kind of horse, which, over several centuries of natural selection in an extraordinarily demanding environment, is precisely what it did. The Yakutian cattle breed underwent a parallel transformation. Smaller and hardier than most cattle breeds, with a metabolism and fat-storing capacity adapted to surviving on minimal nutrition during the long winter months when fodder is scarce and cold is absolute, Yakutian cattle can endure temperatures that would be lethal to European dairy breeds within a short period. They were kept in barns, unlike the horses, but those barns were themselves engineering achievements of the first order, as we will explore when we get to the section on architecture. The milk and butter produced by Yakutian cattle became central to the Saka diet and to Saka cultural identity in ways that extended far beyond simple nutrition. Butter, in particular, accumulated a cultural significance in Saka life that would be difficult to overstate. It was food, certainly, but it was also an offering to spirits, a medium of social exchange, a marker of wealth and generosity, and an ingredient in rituals of hospitality so elaborate and so freighted with meaning that getting them wrong could cause genuine social damage. The Saka did not arrive in Yakutia to find an empty landscape. They moved into a region already occupied by the Yukagir, the Evenki, the Even, and other groups who had been living there for centuries or millennia. The nature of the interactions between the incoming Saka and the existing inhabitants is complex, and historians still argue whether those interactions were primarily characterized by conflict and displacement or by gradual integration and cultural exchange. The truth, as is almost always the case in these situations, appears to have been both, varying by time and place and the specific groups involved. What is certain is that the Saka absorbed a great deal of knowledge and practice from the peoples they encountered: hunting techniques, knowledge of local geography, certain elements of material culture, and crucially, adaptations of clothing and shelter appropriate to the specific conditions of the Yakutian environment. This knowledge transfer was not a one-way process. The Saka also influenced the groups around them, and the long-term result was a complex, layered cultural landscape in which different traditions interacted, merged, and diverged in patterns that researchers are still mapping. By the time Russian Cossack explorers and traders arrived in the region in the 17th century, the advance guard of the Russian imperial expansion eastward that would eventually reach the Pacific and beyond, the Saka had established themselves as the dominant cultural and economic power in the central Lena Valley, with a society organized around semi-nomadic pastoralism, a rich oral literary tradition, an elaborate spiritual system centered on shamanism and the worship of a pantheon of nature spirits, and a material culture so specifically adapted to the Yakutian environment that it represented centuries of accumulated innovation. The Russians, to their credit in this particular instance, recognized that they were dealing with a sophisticated and well-organized society and initially pursued a policy of negotiated tribute rather than direct conquest, demanding yasak, a fur tax, from the Saka in exchange for nominal submission to Russian imperial authority, while largely leaving internal social organization intact. This pragmatic arrangement did not prevent significant violence, displacement, and the introduction of devastating epidemic diseases to which the indigenous populations had no immunity, but it did mean that Saka cultural institutions survived the initial contact period in a more intact state than many indigenous peoples encountered by expanding European powers during the same era. The horse, in Saka culture, occupied a position of profound spiritual and social significance that went far beyond its practical utility as a transport animal or a source of meat and milk. The Saka were, and in significant ways remain, a horse people in the deepest cultural sense, the kind of relationship with a particular animal that shapes cosmology, ritual, social hierarchy, aesthetic sensibility, and collective identity simultaneously. The spring festival of Isiaq, which we will spend more time with in a later section, centered on the ritual consumption of kumis, fermented mare's milk, and the ceremonial blessing of horses as a way of renewing the relationship between the human community, its animals, and the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. Horses were sacrificed in important rituals. Horse imagery appeared in Saka art and ornament. The quality of a man's horses was a direct statement about his social standing and his competence as a provider. And the Saka vocabulary around horses, the dozens of specific terms for different ages, colors, gaits, temperaments, and conditions of horses, reflects the depth of attention that a culture pays to the thing it considers most important. Cattle herding, meanwhile, was not simply an economic activity but a complete way of organizing time, space, and social life. The annual cycle of the Saka pastoral economy moved in a rhythm dictated by the needs of the animals and the conditions of the land. Summer was spent at riverside pastures where the cattle could graze on the rich meadow grasses that grew with almost frantic urgency during the brief, intense growing season. Taking advantage of the nearly continuous daylight of the subarctic summer, when the sun barely sets for weeks at a time and plants push growth at a rate that seems almost impossible after the long deprivation of winter. Families moved to their summer camps, lived in lighter, more temporary structures, fished the rivers intensively, gathered berries and plants, and did the repair and preparation work. Sewing, tool-making, construction, that would see them through the coming winter. As summer faded and the first frosts arrived in August, yes, August, the shoulder of the year is brutally short in Yakutia, the movement back to winter quarters began. The cattle were brought closer to the homestead, fodder that had been cut and dried during summer was laid in, and the community began the long process of settling into its winter configuration. The social unit of this seasonal life was the family group, often extended across several generations and including lateral kin, organized around the management of a shared herd and a shared physical space. Larger social groupings, the Nasleg, a community of related family groups, and above that the Ulus, a broader territorial and political unit, organized relations between families, managed access to pasture and fishing grounds, handled disputes, and provided the collective labor for tasks that no single family could accomplish alone. The hereditary leaders of these units, the Toyans, accumulated wealth in cattle and horses and exercised both economic and ritual authority within their communities. The relationship between the Toyans and the Russian imperial administration that gradually extended its control over the region was one of negotiation and accommodation on both sides, as the Russians found that governing this vast and remote territory without the cooperation of local leaders was essentially impossible, and the local leaders found ways to maintain their authority and cultural institutions within the framework of Russian nominal sovereignty. This balancing act, maintaining cultural integrity and internal social cohesion while navigating the demands and pressures of external powers, is a theme that runs continuously through Saka history from the 17th century to the present day. It required a kind of social and cultural resilience that is itself a form of survival skill, as sophisticated in its way as the ability to dress correctly for -70 or to build a stable structure on permafrost. The Saka survived the Russian imperial period, survived Soviet collectivization, which was genuinely devastating to the pastoral economy and social structure that had sustained the community for centuries, and emerged into the post-Soviet era with their language, their cultural practices, and their identity not merely intact but in many respects revitalized, a story of cultural endurance that is as remarkable as anything else about this extraordinary people. But before we get to the modern era, which will be the subject of our final section tonight, there is so much more to explore in the extraordinary depth of Saka material culture. Because survival in Yakutia was never just about having the right social organization or the right animals. It was about the specific, technical, hard-won knowledge encoded in every object, every garment, every building, every meal. It was about knowing, with a precision that allowed no margin for error, exactly how to interact with the cold on its own terms. And nowhere is this more evident, nowhere is the accumulated genius of survival more visible, than in the clothing, the extraordinary, layered, animal-derived, meticulously constructed clothing that kept human bodies alive at temperatures that should by any reasonable physiological calculation have killed them. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than the head, the kind that cannot be fully described in words but must be learned through years of watching, touching, making mistakes, and trying again. The craft of cold-weather clothing in Yakutia is exactly this kind of knowledge, and it represents one of the most sophisticated applications of material science and human ingenuity in the entire archaeological and ethnographic record of our species. You might be tempted, lying there in your warm bed, to think of fur clothing as a relatively simple affair. You kill an animal, you wrap yourself in its skin, problem solved. But that picture is so far from the reality of what Yakushin clothing makers actually did that it barely qualifies as a caricature. The truth is layered, literally and figuratively, and it is genuinely astonishing. Start with the fundamental physics of the problem, because understanding why Yakushin clothing works the way it does requires understanding what extreme cold is actually doing to your body. Your body generates heat through metabolic processes, the chemical reactions of cellular respiration that keep your organs functioning and your muscles moving. At moderate cold, the body responds by constricting blood vessels near the skin surface, reducing heat loss by keeping warm blood away from the areas where it would radiate into the environment. It also begins shivering, involuntary muscle contractions that generate additional heat as a side effect. These are effective short-term strategies, but they have limits. At the temperatures routinely encountered in Yakutia, the body's natural thermoregulatory mechanisms are simply insufficient. Without external insulation of the right quality and configuration, core body temperature will drop, organ function will deteriorate, and death will follow. The timeline for this process at -40 degrees Celsius with no protection is measured in minutes rather than hours. The clothing is not a comfort. It is the difference between being alive and not being alive. The first principle of Yakushin cold weather clothing is layering, and this principle is applied with a sophistication that modern outdoor gear manufacturers have essentially rediscovered and commercialized for the global market. The innermost layer serves to wick moisture, primarily sweat, away from the skin, because wet skin loses heat approximately 25 times faster than dry skin, and even in extreme cold the body sweats during physical activity. Traditional Yakushin inner garments were often made from the skin of young deer or reindeer with the fur turned inward against the body, the short, dense underfur creating both a moisture-managing and an insulating layer directly against the skin. The middle layers provided the bulk of insulation, trapping still air, the actual insulating medium in any fur or down system, since it is the air that is warm rather than the material itself. In the deep, dense guard hairs and underfur of animals whose coats were selected specifically for their insulating properties. The outer layer served as a wind and moisture barrier, typically made from tanned hide or, in certain communities, from materials derived from the intestines or stomachs of marine mammals, which could be processed into a lightweight, nearly waterproof membrane of extraordinary effectiveness. The selection of animal skins for different parts of a garment reflects a level of material knowledge that is breathtaking in its specificity. Different animals, different seasons of the year, and even different parts of the same animal's body produce fur of dramatically different qualities, and Yakushin clothing makers knew and exploited these differences with the precision of engineers working to specification. Reindeer fur is particularly prized for its insulating properties because each individual guard hair is hollow, a structural feature that traps air within the hair itself, adding an additional layer of insulation beyond what is provided by the air spaces between hairs. This hollow hair structure also makes reindeer fur remarkably lightweight relative to its insulating power, which matters enormously when you are wearing multiple layers of clothing that must allow for freedom of movement. A garment that is warm but so heavy and stiff that it prevents you from walking properly, working effectively, or responding quickly to an emergency is a garment that will get you killed as efficiently as no garment at all. Reindeer fur from animals killed in autumn, when the winter coat is at its fullest development but has not yet been worn down by months of contact with snow and brush, was considered the finest material for outer garments. The fur of summer-killed reindeer, shorter and less dense, was used for different purposes, lighter garments for the shoulder seasons, or as lining material where a thinner layer was appropriate. The leg skins of reindeer, which have shorter, denser, more tightly packed fur than the body, were traditionally used for boot construction, because they provided excellent insulation combined with durability and some degree of water resistance. The skin from the reindeer's forehead, small in area but extremely dense in fur, was prized for the face-framing ruffs around hood openings, where its particular qualities helped protect the most vulnerable exposed skin from wind and cold. Not a single part of the animal was wasted, and every part was used where its specific properties were most advantageous. This is not sentimentality about resourcefulness. This is engineering. The boots, called etrabis or torbases in different regional traditions, with vocabulary varying across the many groups whose clothing traditions have contributed to the broader Yakushin material culture, deserve particular attention, because keeping the feet warm in Yakushin conditions is one of the most technically demanding challenges in the entire clothing system. The ground at -70 is a heat sink of almost unlimited capacity, and cold conducted upward through inadequate footwear will chill the feet, then the legs, then ultimately compromise core temperature in a cascade that is difficult to reverse once it begins. Traditional Yakutian boots addressed this problem through a multi-component system of extraordinary ingenuity. An outer boot of reindeer leg skin, for outward, provided the primary insulation and a degree of moisture resistance. Inside this, removable inner boots of softer skin or felted material provided additional insulation and, critically, could be taken out and dried separately, because boots accumulate moisture from both sweat and melting snow contact, and wet insulation is, as we have established, dramatically less effective than dry insulation. Inside the inner boots, thick insoles of dried sedgegrass, a plant that grows abundantly in the marshy areas of the Yakutian summer landscape and that has genuinely good insulating properties when dried, provided a final layer of thermal protection while also helping to wick moisture away from the foot. The sedgegrass insoles were replaced regularly, and the practice of drying and airing footwear components every night was as fundamental to Yakutian cold weather routine as brushing your teeth is to yours. The construction of these garments required tools and techniques as specialized as the materials themselves. Needles of bone and, later, steel, extremely fine, because thick needles would leave holes large enough to allow cold air penetration at the seam, were used with sinew thread rather than plant fiber thread. Sinew, the connective tissue from animal tendons, has properties that make it almost ideally suited for sewing cold weather garments. It is strong, flexible even at extreme cold, and, this is the clever part, it swells slightly when wet, which means that seams sewn with sinew thread actually become more airtight when moisture is present, rather than less so. Modern tent manufacturers discovered this property and used it in the design of waterproof tent seams for decades before synthetic alternatives became available. The women of Yakutia, and it was primarily women who performed this craft, though the knowledge was broadly distributed and men were not ignorant of the principles involved, had understood and applied this property for centuries before any material scientist put it in a paper. The process of preparing hides for use in clothing was itself a lengthy, labor-intensive, and highly skilled undertaking. Raw hide, if simply dried, becomes stiff and brittle, useless for clothing and potentially dangerous in conditions where a garment that cracks or tears can mean death. The tanning process, using a combination of mechanical working, which breaks down the protein structure of the hide to create flexibility, and chemical treatment using animal brain, liver, urine, or other organic materials that contain the enzymes and compounds necessary to stabilize the hide, required days of sustained effort and considerable expertise. Brain tanning, in which the emulsified brain of the animal is worked into the hide and then smoked to fix the process, produces a leather of remarkable softness and flexibility, comfortable even at extreme cold and capable of being folded and creased without damage. The smoking step additionally imparts some degree of water resistance and helps preserve the hide against microbial degradation. Historians still argue whether the smoking technique was independently developed multiple times across the circumpolar world or whether it represents a single invention that spread through cultural contact, but whatever its origins, its effectiveness is not in question. The overall silhouette of the traditional Saka outer garment, a long coat, typically reaching to mid-calf or below, with a fitted body and full skirt-like lower section, was not arbitrary or purely aesthetic. The length provided coverage for the vulnerable thigh and knee area, where major blood vessels run close to the surface and heat loss can be rapid. The fitted body minimized dead air space that would take too long to warm and that would cool quickly if the wearer stopped moving. The flared lower section allowed freedom of movement for walking through deep snow, a consideration that anyone who has tried to walk quickly in a straight, narrow garment through knee-deep powder will appreciate immediately. The hood was invariably deep and generously sized, allowing it to be pulled forward to create a warm, sheltered microenvironment around the face, with the ruff of dense fur around the opening serving as a windbreak that also helped prevent the moist air of exhaled breath from condensing and freezing on the face. The whole system was designed around the reality that the wearer would sometimes be active, walking, working, hunting, and sometimes stationary, and that the transition between these states created different thermal management challenges that the clothing had to address simultaneously. One of the genuinely quirky aspects of Yakutian cold weather clothing tradition is the approach to mittens versus gloves. In most extreme cold weather cultures, mittens are strongly preferred over fingered gloves for the simple reason that keeping the fingers together allows them to share warmth. While separated fingers each lose heat independently, cooling much faster. Yakushin tradition generally follows this preference, with mittens made from reindeer fur being the standard handwear for extreme conditions. However, the Saka developed a particularly elegant solution to the problem of needing fine motor control for tasks, hunting, tool use, camp tasks, that cannot be performed with mittens. The inner glove, a thin, close-fitting liner of soft leather worn inside the mitten, allowed the outer mitten to be quickly removed for delicate work, while the inner glove provided enough protection to allow perhaps a minute or two of fine manual work before the fingers became dangerously cold. The inner glove was then warmed inside the mitten before the next bout of exposed work. This alternating system, simple in concept but demanding in its disciplined execution, represents exactly the kind of behavioral technological hybrid that characterizes Yakushin cold survival at its best. Not just the right equipment, but the right protocol for using it. The aesthetic dimension of Yakushin clothing is something that deserves acknowledgement, because it would be a disservice to describe these garments purely in terms of their thermal engineering without noting that they are also, by any reasonable aesthetic standard, extraordinarily beautiful objects. The decorative traditions applied to cold weather garments, geometric embroidery in colored thread or beads along seams and hemlines, applique work in contrasting fur colors creating patterns of remarkable complexity, metal ornaments sewn to surfaces or dangling from hems to catch the light and create sound during movement, transformed purely functional objects into statements of identity, social status, regional affiliation, and aesthetic sensibility. A fully decorated Saka festive garment, with its flowing lines, its gleaming fur, its careful geometric patterning, and its delicate metalwork, is an object of genuine visual magnificence. The kind of thing that, when you see it in a museum display, makes you stop and look for longer than you expected to. The people who made these garments were not just engineers. They were artists, and the two impulses were never separate in their minds. The knowledge embedded in this clothing tradition represents thousands of years of accumulated experimentation, refinement, and cultural transmission. A library of material wisdom encoded not in books but in objects and in the skilled hands that made them. When Soviet collectivization policies in the 20th century disrupted the traditional economy, and with it many of the conditions under which this knowledge was practiced and transmitted, the loss was not merely economic or cultural in a vague sense. It was a genuine erosion of a specific, irreplaceable body of technical knowledge that had kept people alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth for centuries. The revival and documentation of these traditions in the post-Soviet period has been one of the more encouraging cultural stories to emerge from the Saka Republic in recent decades, though the work of recovery is never as simple or as complete as one might wish. If the clothing of Yakutia represents the external armor against the cold, then the food represents something equally vital and considerably more interesting to think about as you lie there contemplating the extraordinary ingenuity of people who had to solve every problem of survival from scratch. Food in Yakutia is not merely sustenance. It is chemistry, architecture, medicine, and cultural identity simultaneously, and the Yakushin approach to obtaining, preserving, and consuming calories in an environment where the growing season lasts approximately 6 weeks and the temperature for the remaining 46 weeks ranges from merely freezing to apocalyptically cold is one of the most creative and pragmatically brilliant culinary traditions in human history. Your local farmer's market, with its artisanal cheeses and heritage tomatoes, has absolutely nothing on the Yakushin permafrost pantry. Begin with the central fact that defines everything about food in this environment. The cold is not the enemy of food preservation. It is the mechanism of it. In a world where refrigeration technology did not exist until the 20th century, and where the logistics of preserving food through the long winter months was literally a matter of life and death, the Yakushin environment offered something that civilizations in warmer climates spent enormous energy and ingenuity trying to approximate: a natural, constant, perfectly calibrated deep freeze that operated without fuel, without maintenance, and without ever breaking down. The permafrost beneath the ground surface maintained temperatures of between -5 and -15 degrees Celsius year-round, colder in the deeper layers, stable in a way that no above-ground storage system could match. Food placed in pits dug down into the permafrost was preserved with a reliability and effectiveness that the most sophisticated modern cold chain would struggle to improve upon. The use of permafrost as a food storage system is ancient in the region, predating the Saka arrival by millennia. The peoples of the Yakushin area dug storage pits into the frozen ground, some of them quite elaborate, with timber-lined chambers and carefully fitted covers to minimize temperature fluctuation, and used them to store meat, fish, butter, and other perishables through the winter and, in the coldest and most deeply frozen areas, year-round. These were not temporary expedients but permanent household infrastructure, as fundamental to the domestic economy as a well or a hearth. The modern equivalent, and this is one of the stranger continuities between ancient practice and contemporary life, is the underground food cellar that many Yakutsk residents still maintain beneath their apartment buildings or in the courtyards of private homes. Essentially a pit dug into the permafrost that functions as a perfectly effective natural refrigerator. In a region where electricity supply can be unreliable and where the consequences of food spoilage in a remote community can be severe, the permafrost cellar remains a genuinely practical technology, not a quaint anachronism. The protein sources available in Yakutia have always been dominated by animals, for the straightforward reason that the growing season is too short and the climate too extreme for most plant crops to provide a meaningful caloric contribution to the diet. The possible exceptions, certain root vegetables, hardy grains, and leafy plants that Soviet-era agricultural programs attempted to introduce and cultivate in the region, were always marginal contributors at best, and the traditional Yakutian diet before Russian contact was overwhelmingly animal-based. Meat from horses and cattle, fish from the rivers, reindeer meat obtained through hunting or from herding communities, and the meat and fat of wild game including birds, hares, and various other species constituted the caloric foundation of existence. Fat, in particular, was not merely desirable but physiologically essential in quantities that would alarm a modern cardiologist. At extreme cold, the body burns calories at dramatically elevated rates simply to maintain core temperature, and fat, with its 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein or carbohydrate, is the most energy-dense food available. The Yakutian traditional diet, high in animal fat by any contemporary nutritional standard, was not the result of culinary preference but of thermodynamic necessity. Horse meat occupies a central and cherished place in Saka cuisine that reflects the animal's cultural significance as much as its nutritional value. The Yakutian horse, having spent centuries accumulating fat reserves to survive winter on minimal forage, produces meat and particularly subcutaneous fat that is richer than that of horses raised in more temperate conditions. Foal meat, from young horses slaughtered in autumn when they have reached a good weight on summer grazing, is considered a particular delicacy, tender and well-marbled in a way that reflects the animal's rapid growth during the brief summer. The preparation of horse meat takes many forms, from the simply practical, boiled in large quantities and eaten hot during the coldest months, to the elaborately ceremonial, where specific cuts and preparations are associated with particular social occasions, seasonal festivals, and ritual contexts. One of the most distinctive Saka preparations is the consumption of raw frozen meat, stroganina, which deserves its own moment of attention because it represents one of the genuinely unique contributions of the circumpolar north to the global culinary repertoire. Stroganina is, in its simplest description, raw frozen fish or meat shaved into thin curls with a sharp knife and eaten immediately, while still frozen, often dipped in salt. The word itself comes from the Russian verb strogat, meaning to plane or shave, which accurately describes the technique. The fish most commonly used is nelma, a large, fatty whitefish from the Lena River system, or the Siberian sturgeon, both of which have a clean, mild flavor and a fat content high enough to give the frozen shavings a rich, almost buttery quality on the tongue as they thaw against the warmth of the mouth. The experience of eating stroganina is genuinely unlike anything in the culinary experience of most people reading or listening to this. The combination of the hard, cold texture of the just-shaved curls, the clean oceanic smell, the way the fat releases flavor as the fish warms, and the bright contrast of the salt creates something that regular sashimi lovers describe as familiar in principle but completely different in character. It is also, nutritionally speaking, an extremely efficient delivery of high-quality protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and fat-soluble vitamins in a form that requires no fuel to prepare, which in an environment where fuel is precious and sometimes scarce is not a trivial advantage. The preservation of fish took many other forms as well. Drying hanging-gutted fish on wooden racks in the open air during the brief summer produced a shelf-stable product of concentrated protein and flavor that could be stored and eaten through the winter without further processing. The cold, dry air of the Yakutian summer, low in humidity and bacteria inhibiting in its own right, was ideal for this purpose, and the forests around Yakutia communities in summer were hung with drying fish in quantities that reflected the intensity of the summer fishing effort and the absolute necessity of laying in sufficient stores before the rivers froze again. Fermented fish, allowed to undergo controlled decomposition in ways that produce strong flavors and additional preservation, also featured in some regional traditions, though this practice was more characteristic of certain coastal and northern groups than of the Saka heartland communities. Historians still argue whether the various fermentation traditions of the circumpolar north represent independent developments in different communities or reflect the spread of a technique from a single point of origin, the kind of question that seems academic until you realize it is actually a window into the entire history of human communication and cultural exchange across the Arctic. The dairy traditions of the Saka deserve extended attention, both for their practical ingenuity and for their cultural significance. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, has already been mentioned in the context of the Isiaq festival, but its role in everyday Saka life extended far beyond the ceremonial. Mare's milk, produced during the summer months when the maras were lactating, was fermented in large leather bags or wooden vessels through the activity of naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria, producing a mildly alcoholic, effervescent, pleasantly sour drink of significant nutritional value. The fermentation process made the lactose in the milk more digestible for adults who, like many populations with limited historical exposure to dairy, had varying degrees of lactase persistence, the genetic adaptation that allows continued digestion of lactose beyond infancy. Kumis was drunk fresh in summer and preserved in various ways for winter consumption, though its production was inherently seasonal and its summer abundance was an important marker of the good times that sustained people through the memory of winter. Butter, churned from the cream of cattle milk, was another central product of the Saka dairy economy, and its preservation presented interesting challenges and solutions. Butter stored in cold conditions keeps extremely well, and the permafrost cellar was again the primary preservation mechanism. But the Saka also developed a preserved butter product called salamat, a cooked butter preparation involving the reduction of cream or butter with flour or other starchy material, that extended shelf life and created a richer, more calorie-dense product suitable for the most demanding winter conditions. The ritual significance of butter in Saka culture was such that offerings of butter to spirits and deities were a standard element of many ceremonies, and the quality and quantity of butter a household could provide at communal gatherings was a direct reflection of its prosperity and social standing. A family that could offer generous quantities of good butter was a family that had managed its animals well, managed its pastures well, and managed its relationship with the land well, all things that the community had reason to value and respect. Beyond the major domesticated animal products, the Yakutian diet incorporated a wide range of wild foods obtained through hunting, fishing, and gathering, and this diversity was not merely a pleasant supplement to the main diet but a genuine nutritional safeguard. The vitamins and micronutrients absent from a diet of pure meat and fat, particularly vitamin C, the absence of which causes scurvy, were obtained from sources that might surprise you. Raw meat and raw fish, particularly organs including liver, kidney, and brain, contain significant quantities of vitamin C that is destroyed by cooking. The Yakutian practice of eating raw or lightly processed animal products was not simply a matter of taste or tradition. It was, whether or not the practitioners conceptualized it in these terms, a genuine nutritional strategy that prevented the deficiency diseases that plagued European explorers who attempted to live on cooked rations in similar environments. The irony of British naval expeditions dying of scurvy while indigenous Arctic peoples living in the same latitudes remained perfectly healthy is one of the more instructive lessons in the history of nutrition, a lesson that took Western medicine an embarrassingly long time to fully understand. Plant foods, while limited, were gathered with considerable knowledge and purpose during the summer months. Various species of berries, cloudberries, crowberries, lingonberries, and others were collected in the short window when they were available and preserved through freezing, the most natural and obvious preservation method in a land where a natural freezer of unlimited capacity becomes available in September and stays operational until May. Pine nuts, collected from the Siberian pine where it grew in accessible areas, provided fat and protein. Various roots and greens were consumed fresh in season, providing micronutrients during the period of maximum availability. The knowledge of which plants were edible when they were at their best, and where they grew most reliably in the local landscape was part of the same encyclopedic environmental knowledge that covered animals, weather, and terrain, the comprehensive map of a specific place, carried in human memory and transmitted through the generations with painstaking care. One of the genuinely quirky corners of Yakutian food culture involves the mammoth, not as a food source in the usual sense, but as an occasionally encountered frozen protein of immense age. There are documented historical accounts of dogs and occasionally humans consuming the flesh of frozen mammoths encountered in permafrost exposures, and while the idea of eating meat tens of thousands of years old sounds like the premise of a science fiction story, the preservation quality of some permafrost frozen mammoth remains is such that the muscle tissue, while certainly not appetizing by modern standards, has retained its basic protein structure. Whether any human has actually found frozen mammoth flesh palatable, as opposed to merely edible under desperate circumstances, is a question that the historical record does not answer with satisfying clarity. What it does confirm is that the boundary between deep time and the present is thinner in Yakutia than almost anywhere else on Earth, and that the cold which preserves the past has always been the same cold that shapes the present. There is a particular engineering problem that presents itself when you decide to build a permanent human settlement on ground that is frozen solid to a depth of several hundred meters, and that problem is this: buildings are warm. The people inside them generate heat. The heating systems that keep those people alive generate more heat. And all of that heat, if it conducts downward through the floor of the building into the ground beneath, will begin to thaw the permafrost. Thawing permafrost does not simply become soft ground in the way that frozen soil in a temperate climate thaws in spring to reveal perfectly serviceable earth beneath. It becomes something considerably more problematic: a waterlogged, unstable, structurally compromised substrate with the load-bearing capacity of wet porridge, into which any building sitting on it will slowly, inexorably, and often dramatically sink, tilt, crack, and eventually collapse. This is not a theoretical concern. It has happened to thousands of buildings across the permafrost zone, and the visual evidence of it: structures leaning at improbable angles, staircases leading to doors that are now 2 meters above ground level, walls with cracks wide enough to put your hand through, is a standard feature of the built landscape in many Siberian towns. Building on permafrost, it turns out, is one of the most technically demanding challenges in all of civil engineering, and the people of Yakutia have been grappling with it with varying degrees of success for as long as they have been building permanent structures. The traditional Saka solution to this problem was, like most traditional solutions to extreme environmental challenges, arrived at through centuries of observation, experiment, and the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from watching previous approaches fail. The traditional winter dwelling of the Saka, the Balagan, was not a structure that tried to fight the permafrost problem so much as one that had evolved, through long practice, to coexist with it. The Balagan was a low, trapezoidal structure, wider at the base than at the top, with walls that sloped slightly inward as they rose, built from a framework of logs covered with a thick layer of compacted earth and manure, which provided both insulation and structural stability. The walls were typically between 1 and 2 meters thick at the base, giving the structure a thermal mass so substantial that it could maintain interior temperatures well above freezing, even when exterior temperatures plunged to -50 or below, with relatively modest heating from a central hearth. The sloped wall design was not accidental. The wide base distributed the weight of the structure over a larger area of ground, reducing the pressure per unit area and therefore the rate at which the underlying permafrost was disturbed. The earth and manure cladding insulated not just the interior from the exterior cold but also the ground beneath from the interior warmth, creating a buffer that reduced, though could not eliminate, the heat transfer downward into the frozen substrate. The floor of the Balagan was typically at or slightly below ground level, but insulated with layers of animal skins and dried plant material that again served to minimize heat transfer to the ground. The whole structure sat relatively lightly on the landscape, its weight spread rather than concentrated, its thermal footprint managed through passive insulation rather than active intervention. The interior arrangement of the Balagan reflected a careful understanding of heat stratification, the physical reality that warm air rises and cold air sinks, which in an enclosed space creates distinct thermal zones at different heights. The sleeping platforms, wide wooden benches running along the walls, were elevated above the floor level, placing the occupants in the warmer air near the ceiling rather than the coldest air at floor level. The central hearth, positioned to maximize radiant heat distribution to all parts of the interior, burned wood at a rate carefully calibrated to the conditions outside. More fuel on the coldest nights, less when temperatures were relatively moderate, the management of the fire being a continuous, skilled task rather than a simple matter of keeping something burning. The door was positioned and sized to minimize cold air infiltration, and elaborate systems of entrance vestibules, essentially airlocks of animal hide or wood that created a buffer zone between the bitter exterior and the warm interior, reduced the temperature shock of entry and exit, and prevented the sudden influx of cold air that would occur every time the door opened without such a system. The smoke management in these structures was a particular area of ingenuity. Early Balagan designs used a simple smoke hole in the roof, functional but wasteful of heat, since the chimney effect created by an open hole drew warm interior air outward as smoke rose, requiring continuous additional heating to compensate. Later designs incorporated more sophisticated chimney arrangements using hollow logs or, eventually, clay and stone constructions that allowed better draft control and more efficient combustion. The transition from a central open hearth to a more enclosed stove design, a transition that occurred in the Saka context partly through contact with Russian settlers who brought their own stove-building traditions, dramatically improved the thermal efficiency of interior heating and reduced fuel consumption in ways that had cascading benefits for the entire domestic economy. Less wood burned meant less wood cut, hauled, and split, a significant reduction in one of the most labor-intensive aspects of winter life. The summer dwelling, the Uraha, presented entirely different design requirements, with temperatures potentially reaching 35 degrees Celsius in summer and the mosquito population at its diabolical peak. The priority shifted from heat retention to ventilation, light, and insect management. The Uraha was a conical or teepee-like structure of birch bark sheets stretched over a pole framework, lightweight, portable, quick to erect and dismantle, and well-suited to the semi-nomadic summer life of moving between pastures and fishing sites. The birch bark was an excellent material for this application, waterproof, flexible, and available in large sheets from the birch trees that grew abundantly in the more sheltered and southern areas of the Saka territory. The portability of the Uraha was essential, since the summer economy required movement, and a family that could break camp and relocate in a matter of hours was a family that could follow the best pasture, the best fishing, and the best conditions with a flexibility that fixed structures would have prevented. The arrival of Russian influence brought new building materials, new construction techniques, and new structural forms that were adopted, adapted, and integrated into the Yakutian built environment with the same pragmatic openness to useful innovation that characterized the broader Saka cultural response to external contact. Log cabin construction, using horizontally laid, interlocking logs to create walls, was a technique brought by Russian settlers and adopted by Saka builders with enthusiasm, because it worked well with the abundant timber resources of the boreal forest and could be adapted to permafrost conditions through the application of traditional knowledge about thermal management and ground contact minimization. The combination of Russian structural technique with Saka environmental knowledge produced a regional vernacular architecture that was neither purely Russian nor purely traditional Saka, but something distinctly of its place. Practical, sturdy, and carefully calibrated to its impossible environment. The Soviet period brought architecture to Yakutia on a scale and of a type that the region had never seen before, and the results were educational in ways that the planners had not entirely anticipated. The Soviet project of industrializing and urbanizing the Siberian North brought engineers, architects, and construction workers from elsewhere in the Soviet Union, many of whom arrived with technical training appropriate to the temperate zones of European Russia and with limited understanding of the specific engineering challenges posed by permafrost. The resulting buildings, concrete apartment blocks, industrial facilities, administrative buildings, were designed according to standard Soviet construction norms that did not adequately account for permafrost dynamics, and the consequences were predictable in retrospect if not always in advance. Buildings sank, walls cracked, foundations shifted as the permafrost beneath them thawed in response to the warmth conducted downward from the heated structures above. The urban landscape of Yakutsk in the mid-20th century was, by various accounts, a genuinely alarming collection of structurally compromised buildings in various stages of slowly losing their argument with the ground. The engineering response to this crisis produced some of the most innovative permafrost construction techniques in the world, and Yakutsk became, somewhat unexpectedly, a global center of permafrost engineering expertise. The key insight, which seems obvious once stated but required considerable theoretical and practical development to implement effectively, was that the problem was not the permafrost itself but the thawing of the permafrost. If the permafrost could be kept frozen, kept at its natural temperature, it would remain a perfectly stable, indeed extraordinarily strong foundation material. Frozen ground has compressive strength comparable to concrete. The challenge was to build heated structures on top of it without the heat from those structures thawing it. The solution that became standard in Yakutsk and across the Siberian permafrost zone was the pile foundation system, in which buildings are elevated above the ground on concrete or steel piles driven or drilled deep into the permafrost. The gap between the floor of the building and the ground surface, typically ranging from 1 to 2 meters, allows cold air to circulate freely beneath the building, carrying away any heat that conducts downward through the floor and maintaining the permafrost at its natural frozen temperature. Walk through Yakutsk today, and this is one of the most immediately striking visual features of the built environment. Buildings that appear to be standing on stilts, elevated above the ground on rows of concrete columns, with the frigid Arctic wind blowing freely through the space beneath. The aesthetic is not exactly what you would find in an architectural digest feature on urban elegance, but the functional logic is impeccable, and the buildings built on this principle have remained structurally sound while their poorly designed predecessors have tilted and cracked around them. Additional engineering refinements developed in Yakutsk included thermosiphon systems, passive heat exchange devices that use the phase transition of a refrigerant fluid to pump heat out of the ground beneath foundations, actively maintaining permafrost temperatures even in conditions where the building above might otherwise cause localized thawing. These devices, which require no external power to operate and work continuously as long as the exterior temperature is cold enough, which in Yakutia it reliably is for most of the year, represent a genuinely elegant engineering solution that has been adopted in permafrost construction projects around the world, including in Alaska, Canada, and Scandinavia. The engineering knowledge developed in Yakutia, born of the absolute necessity of solving a problem that no other major city on Earth faced in quite the same way, has become a global resource of considerable value. The infrastructure challenges of building on permafrost extend far beyond the buildings themselves. Water and sewage pipes cannot be buried in the ground. Freezing temperatures and frost heave would rupture them within a single winter. Instead, Yakutsk's water and sewage infrastructure runs above ground in heated, insulated ducts called uteplateli, essentially long, low boxes of insulated material running along the sides of streets and between buildings, inside which the pipes are maintained above freezing by electrical heating elements. These ducts are a ubiquitous and visually distinctive feature of Yakutsk's streetscape, running at ground level or slightly elevated, crossing roads through elevated bridges, connecting buildings in a web of utilitarian infrastructure that looks, to the uninitiated eye, like nothing so much as an enormous system of hamster tunnels for a city of humans. They are, of course, nothing of the sort. They are a completely rational and effective solution to a genuine engineering problem, and they work. Roads present their own permafrost challenges. The freeze-thaw cycle of the active layer, the topmost section of ground that does melt each summer, creates frost heave, the lifting and distortion of road surfaces as water expands during freezing, and the subsequent settling and subsidence as it thaws. Roads in permafrost areas require constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction to remain usable, and the engineering of road beds that minimize frost heave while allowing for drainage during the thaw season is a specialized discipline with its own literature, its own professional community, and its own accumulated body of hard-won knowledge. The winter roads, built directly on frozen rivers and lakes, are in some respects simpler than permanent land roads, because the frozen water provides a naturally flat, naturally strong surface that requires minimal preparation. But they require careful monitoring of ice thickness, and the season of safe use is shrinking, a fact with significant implications that we will return to in the final section of tonight's journey. The built environment of Yakutia, from the earthen walls of the ancient Balagan to the pile-supported concrete towers of modern Yakutsk, represents an unbroken thread of human ingenuity applied to the specific and demanding problem of maintaining warm, stable, dry interior spaces in conditions that work against all three of those qualities with remorseless consistency. Every structure is a negotiation with the cold and the frozen ground, a negotiation conducted with the knowledge that the cold will never tire, will never compromise, and will exploit every weakness with the patient efficiency of physics itself. The fact that people have been winning this negotiation, continuously and in growing numbers, for thousands of years is a testament not to humanity's power over nature but to something more interesting and more admirable. The human capacity to understand nature well enough to work with it rather than against it, to find the grain of the world and cut along it, and to build, in the most literal sense, on foundations of ice. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour of a Yakutian winter night, and remember, in the depths of January that night stretches for 21 hours or more, the cold begins to do things to the human body that are worth understanding in some detail, Not because the details are frightening, though some of them are, but because the physiological story of human survival at extreme cold is one of the most remarkable in all of biology, and because the ways in which the people of Yakutia have understood, managed, and responded to that story, through both traditional medicine and hard-won behavioral knowledge, represent a form of applied science that preceded the formal discipline by centuries. You are warm right now and comfortable, and your body is doing almost none of the things we are about to discuss. Appreciate that for a moment. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of the blanket. And then let's talk about what happens when the cold gets serious. The human body's relationship with cold begins long before temperatures reach anything like Yakutia extremes. The thermoregulatory system, the complex, multi-layered physiological machinery that maintains your core body temperature at approximately 37 degrees Celsius regardless of external conditions, begins responding to cold at temperatures that most people would describe as merely chilly. The first responses are peripheral vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels near the skin surface to reduce the flow of warm blood to areas where it would lose heat rapidly to the environment, and the behavioral responses of seeking shelter, adding clothing, and increasing activity. These are the body's first line of defense, and they are effective across a remarkably wide range of temperatures. The skin can tolerate surface temperatures down to about 15 degrees Celsius without significant functional impairment, and the vasoconstriction response can reduce heat loss from the extremities by as much as 90% compared to the vasodilated state, buying the core considerable time even in harsh conditions. But the extremities pay a price for this protection of the core. As blood flow to the fingers, toes, ears, and nose is reduced, their temperature drops. At around 10 degrees Celsius, the sensation of cold in the fingers becomes uncomfortable. At around 7 degrees, fine motor control begins to deteriorate. The fingers become clumsy, fumbling, increasingly unreliable for the precise tasks that survival in the cold so often demands. At around 4 degrees, pain sets in, a deep, aching cold pain that is the body's urgent signal that damage is approaching. And as temperatures drop further still, the pain paradoxically begins to diminish as nerve function itself is impaired. A dangerous transition, because the reduction of pain signals the beginning of tissue damage rather than its resolution, and the absence of discomfort can lull an inexperienced person into a false sense that things are improving when they are in fact deteriorating rapidly. Frostbite, the actual freezing of tissue, occurs when the temperature of the affected tissue drops below the freezing point of the extracellular fluid, approximately minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. Ice crystals form between cells, drawing water out of the cells themselves through osmotic pressure and causing mechanical damage to cell membranes. The blood vessels in the affected tissue constrict further and may clot, cutting off circulation entirely. The affected tissue turns white or grayish-white, becomes hard to the touch, and loses all sensation. In mild cases, frostnip, as the early stage is sometimes called, the damage is superficial and reversible with gentle rewarming. In more severe cases, the damage extends deeper into the tissue, affecting muscle, tendon, and even bone, and the outcome after rewarming can range from the loss of sensation in the affected area to the loss of the affected part entirely. The noses, ears, fingers, and toes of people who have suffered repeated or severe frostbite tell a visual story that is immediately legible to anyone who has spent time in communities where cold injury is a common occupational hazard. The people of Yakutia were, and are, intimately acquainted with frostbite, its prevention, its recognition, its treatment, and the behavioral disciplines that minimize its occurrence. The traditional knowledge system around cold injury prevention was comprehensive and specific to a degree that modern wilderness medicine has largely validated, if occasionally reframed in different terminology. The importance of keeping clothing dry was understood not as a vague general principle but as a specific, actionable daily practice. The nightly drying of boots and mittens, the immediate changing of wet inner layers, the careful attention to sweating during exertion, and the management of activity level to minimize it. The danger of tight clothing, which restricts circulation and accelerates the cooling of extremities, was understood and incorporated into garment design, with Yakutian footwear and handwear notably generous in their interior volume relative to the foot or hand they enclosed. The importance of keeping moving in extreme cold, to maintain the metabolic heat generation that supplements the insulation of clothing, was a behavioral norm enforced by social pressure as much as individual knowledge. You did not stand still in the cold, not because you were told not to, but because everyone around you understood intuitively that stillness in extreme cold was a slow form of self-harm. The recognition of frostbite in its early stages was a community skill rather than a specialist one. Traveling companions watched each other's faces for the telltale white patches that indicated developing frostbite on the cheeks or nose, areas of the face that the victim cannot see themselves and may not feel as sensation diminishes. The standard response: gentle rewarming using body heat, typically by pressing a warm hand over the affected area or, in the case of feet, placing them against the warm skin of a companion's abdomen, was widely known and immediately applied. The knowledge of what not to do was equally important. Do not rub the affected area with snow, as was once widely believed to be beneficial but is in fact harmful, causing additional mechanical damage to already compromised tissue. Do not apply vigorous heat, which can cause thermal burns to tissue that has lost its pain sensation. Do not rewarm a frozen extremity if there is any possibility it will refreeze before reaching shelter, since freeze-thaw-refreeze cycles cause dramatically more damage than a single freeze episode. This last point, the counterintuitive advice that it is sometimes better to leave a frozen foot frozen and walk on it to safety than to rewarm it prematurely, represents a level of nuanced understanding of the physiology of cold injury that Western medicine did not formally articulate until the 20th century, yet was embedded in the practical knowledge of circumpolar peoples long before. Hypothermia, the dangerous drop in core body temperature, presents a different set of physiological challenges and a different set of behavioral and medical responses. The stages of hypothermia follow a progression that is well documented and that the people of Yakutia understood in experiential terms with considerable accuracy, even without the thermometers and clinical frameworks of modern medicine. Mild hypothermia, core temperature between 32 and 35 degrees Celsius, produces vigorous shivering, impaired coordination, slurred speech, and cognitive impairment that the victim is often unable to recognize in themselves. This cognitive impairment is one of the most dangerous aspects of early hypothermia. The person who most needs to make good decisions about seeking shelter, removing wet clothing, and generating heat is precisely the person whose decision-making capacity is most compromised. The traditional Yakushin response to a person showing signs of hypothermia was immediate and physical. Get them inside, get wet clothing off, apply body heat directly, feed them warm food and fat-rich calories. The communal nature of Yakushin life, in which people traveled and worked in groups, and in which the observation and care of companions was a social norm, provided a natural safety net against the individual cognitive failures that hypothermia induces. Moderate and severe hypothermia, core temperatures below 32 degrees, produce progressively more alarming symptoms. The cessation of shivering as the body exhausts its capacity for thermogenesis, paradoxical undressing as peripheral vasodilation causes a sudden sensation of warmth in a victim whose core temperature is critically low, cardiac arrhythmias, loss of consciousness, and ultimately cardiac arrest. The treatment of severe hypothermia, even with full modern medical resources, remains challenging and requires careful management of the rewarming process to avoid the cardiac complications that can occur if cold blood from the periphery rushes too rapidly back to the heart. Traditional knowledge systems could do limited things for severe hypothermia, primarily providing warmth and nourishment and hoping for recovery, but the social and behavioral norms that prevented people from reaching that state in the first place were the real medical system. Beyond the acute challenges of frostbite and hypothermia, living in extreme cold imposes a range of chronic physiological stresses that the populations of Yakutia have adapted to in ways that geneticists and physiologists are still in the process of fully characterizing. Studies of Yakushin and other Arctic indigenous populations have identified several physiological traits that appear to represent genetic adaptations to cold, differences in basal metabolic rate, in the distribution and activity of brown adipose tissue, in the regulation of peripheral blood flow, and in certain aspects of cardiovascular function that may provide protection against the cardiac stresses of cold exposure. Historians still argue whether these differences represent true genetic adaptation in the evolutionary sense, changes in allele frequencies driven by selection pressure over the generations, or whether they reflect developmental and physiological acclimatization that occurs within individual lifetimes in response to chronic cold exposure. The most likely answer is that both processes contribute in proportions that vary by specific trait, and that disentangling them requires the kind of careful, longitudinal population studies that are difficult to conduct in remote communities and are only now becoming feasible with advances in genomic technology. The traditional medicine of the Yakushin peoples addressed not just the acute consequences of cold exposure, but the full range of health challenges faced by communities living in this extreme environment. The shamanic healing tradition, which we will explore in much greater depth in the next section, addressed illness through a framework of spiritual causation and spiritual intervention that was inseparable from the broader cosmological and social functions of shamanism. But alongside the shamanic tradition, there existed a substantial body of practical, empirical medical knowledge, herbal remedies, physical treatments, dietary interventions, and behavioral recommendations that was transmitted through family networks and community knowledge, rather than through the specialized shamanic lineage. The plant pharmacopoeia of the Yakutia region, while limited compared to that of more botanically diverse environments, contained genuine therapeutic resources that the local medical tradition exploited with considerable sophistication. Various species of willow, relatives of the plant whose bark contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin, were used in preparations for pain and fever. Certain lichens with antimicrobial properties were applied to wounds. Pine resin, with its antiseptic qualities, featured in wound treatment. The internal organs of certain animals, particularly liver, rich in vitamin A and B vitamins, were consumed both as food and as targeted nutritional therapy for specific conditions including night blindness, which in a community that needed to navigate reliably during the long dark winter months was not a trivial health concern. The fat of certain animals was used topically for skin protection and wound treatment, and the practice of greasing exposed skin with animal fat before venturing into extreme cold, reducing evaporative heat loss and providing a degree of protection against frostbite on the face, was a standard preventive health measure as fundamental as putting on a hat. The psychological dimension of surviving in extreme cold and extreme darkness is a dimension that the traditional Yakutian knowledge system addressed through the rich social and spiritual life of the community. Through storytelling, music, communal gathering, ritual, and the maintenance of meaning in conditions that could otherwise tend toward despair. The condition now recognized clinically as seasonal affective disorder, the depression and cognitive impairment triggered by reduced light exposure during winter months, was a reality of Yakutian life long before it had a clinical name, and the cultural practices that evolved to counteract it, by maintaining social engagement, creative activity, and structured ritual during the darkest months, represent a form of community mental health intervention of considerable sophistication. The elaborate tradition of Elanco, the Yakutian heroic epic, performed by specialist singers in sessions that could last for days, was not merely entertainment. It was a technology of psychological sustenance, a way of filling the long dark hours with narrative, beauty, social communion, and the affirmation that human experience had meaning and structure even in the face of an environment that could easily seem indifferent to human existence. The body under siege, it turns out, does not survive alone. It survives in community, sustained by knowledge, by culture, by spiritual framework, and by the irreplaceable warmth, metabolic, social, and psychological, of other human beings who share the same cold and refuse, together, to be defeated by it. That refusal, expressed through the full richness of Yakutian cultural life, is what the next section of tonight's journey is about. There is a moment, in the depths of a Yakutian winter night, when the darkness outside is so complete and so absolute that the boundary between the physical world and whatever lies beyond it seems to grow thin. The temperature is -50 and falling. The stars overhead, on the nights when clouds do not obscure them, are the hard, cold stars of the Arctic, burning with a clarity that has no warmth in it whatsoever, beautiful and indifferent in equal measure. The aurora borealis pulses in curtains of green and violet above the tree line, casting shadows that move. Inside the balagan, the fire crackles and the warmth is real and immediate and precious. And in that space between the fire and the dark, between the warm interior and the lethal exterior, between the known world of the hearth and the unknown world of the frozen forest beyond the door, in that liminal space, the spiritual life of the Yakutian peoples found its most natural and most necessary home. The shamanic tradition of northeastern Siberia is one of the most studied, most debated, and most frequently misrepresented religious and healing traditions in the entire anthropological literature. The word shaman itself comes from this region, from the Tungusic word saman, meaning one who knows or one who is excited, agitated, and it entered the vocabulary of Western scholarship through the accounts of Russian explorers and ethnographers who encountered Siberian spiritual practitioners in the 17th and 18th centuries and found in them something so different from the religious frameworks they were accustomed to that it required an entirely new category of description. That category, shamanism, has since been applied so broadly to such a diverse range of spiritual traditions across the world that it has become almost meaninglessly general in some academic contexts. But in its original, specific Siberian sense, shamanism refers to something quite precise. A tradition in which certain individuals, through a combination of innate spiritual sensitivity, initiatory experience, and extensive training, acquire the ability to enter altered states of consciousness and, in those states, to travel between the layers of the cosmos, the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world on behalf of their communities, negotiating with spirits, retrieving lost souls, diagnosing the spiritual causes of illness, and maintaining the relationships between the human world and the more than human world that kept the community in balance and health. The Saka shamanic tradition, centered on the figure of the Oyun, the male shaman, and the Udigan, the female shaman, was and in certain communities remains one of the most elaborate and richly developed expressions of this broader Siberian shamanic complex. The Saka cosmos, as understood through the shamanic worldview, was organized vertically into multiple layers. Different sources give different numbers, ranging from 3 to 9 or more, connected by a world tree, the Aal Lukmas, an enormous cosmic tree whose roots reached into the lower world and whose upper branches touched the realm of the highest celestial beings. The middle world, the world of ordinary human experience, was populated not just by humans and animals, but by a vast community of spirits associated with specific places, natural phenomena, and cosmic forces. Rivers had spirits. Mountains had spirits. The fire in the hearth had a spirit, addressed daily with small offerings and respectful speech. The wind had spirits. The specific trees in the forest around a settlement had spirits that could be helpful or harmful depending on how they were treated. The world, in the Saka cosmological understanding, was not a collection of inert matter arranged by physical forces but a community of beings with their own intentions, preferences, and capacities for relationship. The I, the benevolent celestial beings of the upper world, were the creators and sustainers of life, associated with light, warmth, fertility, and the positive forces of the natural and human world. The highest of the I was Uriung I Toyin, the White Creator Lord, a supreme celestial being of immense power and beneficence whose domain was the uppermost levels of the cosmic hierarchy. Below him in the celestial hierarchy were numerous other I, each with specific domains and attributes. Onalakshan Khotan, the spirit of the earth and fertility. Yeasit, the protector of cattle and the guardian of childbirth. Aisit, the goddess of birth and destiny who attended every human birth and determined the fate of the newborn. These were not distant, abstract deities of the kind familiar from many world religions but intimate, personally engaged spiritual presences whose influence was felt in the most immediate and practical aspects of daily life. The health of the cattle, the safety of a birth, the success of the summer's grazing. In contrast to the I, the Abihi, the malevolent spirits of the lower world, were sources of illness, misfortune, and death. Disease, in the Saka worldview, was typically understood as the work of Abihi spirits who had captured or damaged a person's soul, or as the consequence of a disrupted relationship between the human community and the spirit world, a violation of proper ritual behavior, a failure of respect, an imbalance that the Abihi exploited. The shaman's primary healing function was to diagnose the spiritual cause of illness, which specific spirit was involved, what violation or imbalance had created the opening for harm, what needed to be done to restore proper relationship, and then to intervene directly in the spirit world through the altered state of the shamanic journey, to retrieve a captured soul, negotiate with or battle an offending spirit, or perform the ritual acts necessary to reestablish balance. The shamanic journey, the central ritual act of the shaman, in which consciousness was transported from the middle world to the upper or lower world while the physical body remained in the gathering of the community, was induced through a combination of rhythmic drumming, chanting, physical movement, and in some traditions the use of psychoactive plant substances, though this last element was more characteristic of some Siberian traditions than others and its role in specifically Saka. Shamanism is a matter of scholarly discussion. The shaman's drum, the dungur, was not merely an instrument but a sacred object of great power, the vehicle of the shamanic journey, sometimes described in traditional accounts as the shaman's horse or the shaman's boat, the thing that carried the shaman between worlds. The construction of a shaman's drum was itself a ritual process of considerable complexity, requiring specific materials gathered in specific ways and assembled according to protocols that ensured the drum's spiritual efficacy. Each drum was unique, decorated with painted symbols that mapped the shaman's personal cosmological understanding, and the drum of a deceased shaman was treated with great care. It retained spiritual power after its owner's death, and improper handling could be dangerous. The initiation of a shaman was not a voluntary career choice in the way that most modern professional paths are chosen. It was understood as a calling, a compulsion imposed by the spirits themselves on individuals they had selected, often from childhood, and typically involving a period of serious illness or psychological crisis that was interpreted as the spirit's preliminary claim on the candidate. The initiatory illness, sometimes called the shaman sickness, could be severe and prolonged, involving visions, dissociative states, and physical symptoms that the community recognized as signs of spiritual election rather than ordinary disease. The resolution of the shaman sickness, the acceptance of the shamanic calling, and the beginning of formal training under an established shaman restored the candidate to health and began the years-long process of learning the cosmological geography, the spirit relationships, the ritual protocols, and the performative skills that a working shaman needed. Historians still argue whether the psychological states associated with shamanic initiation and practice represent a form of culturally structured and socially functional altered consciousness, or whether they reflect genuine psychopathology that was channeled and given meaning by a cultural framework. A debate that reveals more about the assumptions of the debaters than it does, perhaps, about the shamans themselves. The social role of the shaman extended far beyond healing. Shamans were cosmological specialists, repositories of the community's most profound knowledge about the structure of reality and the relationships that sustained it. They were also mediators between the human world and the spirit world, certainly, but also between different human communities, between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknown. Their performances, the great shamanic rituals that could last for hours or even days, combining music, narrative, dance, ventriloquism, theatrical effect, and genuine spiritual intensity in ways that audiences described as overwhelming in their power, were major cultural events that bound communities together, transmitted cosmological knowledge, reinforced social norms, and provided the kind of collective, emotionally intense experience that anthropologists and psychologists increasingly recognize as essential to human community cohesion. A really good shaman, in other words, was doing something that a really good theatrical director, a really good therapist, a really good priest, and a really good community organizer might each do separately, but doing all of it simultaneously in one extraordinary performance for an audience that believed with complete conviction in the literal reality of what was happening. The Isiaq Festival, the great summer celebration of the Saka people, held around the summer solstice when the sun barely sets and the world is briefly, gloriously warm and green, was and remains the most important ritual gathering of the Saka calendar, and it brings together the spiritual, social, and aesthetic dimensions of Saka culture in a single magnificent event. The name derives from a Saka word related to abundance and blessing, and the festival was traditionally understood as a renewal of the relationship between the human community and the eye, a great communal prayer of gratitude for the return of warmth and light, and a petition for continued protection, fertility, and abundance through the coming year. The central ritual act was the communal drinking of kumis, the fermented mare's milk that was, as we established earlier, the emblematic beverage of Saka culture, blessed by the shaman and distributed in the great wooden ritual vessel called the C Yakutia, a vessel whose characteristic shape and intricate carved decoration made it one of the most iconic objects in all of Saka material culture. The choreography of the Isiaq was elaborate and specific. The ritual space was carefully prepared, a sacred circle defined by young birch trees, the white bark tree that was particularly associated with the eye and with the world tree Al Luk Mas. And within this space the ceremonial activities unfolded in a sequence that combined shamanic invocation, communal feasting, athletic competition, music, and the great circular dance called the Ohuokai. The Ohuokai is perhaps the most distinctive and most beloved of all Saka cultural practices. A round dance in which participants form a great circle, moving together in a slow, rhythmic, counterclockwise rotation while a lead singer improvises verses in the traditional melodic style. Each verse responded to by the entire group. The Ohuokai can include dozens, hundreds, or, at major modern celebrations, thousands of participants, forming a circle of extraordinary visual power, and its effect on participants is described uniformly as profoundly communal, joyful, and emotionally resonant in ways that are difficult to articulate but immediately felt. It is, in the most direct sense, a technology of togetherness, a way of making the community feel itself as a community, of experiencing collective identity as a physical, embodied reality rather than an abstract concept. The mythological narratives of the Saka, the corpus of stories about the Ai, the Abihi, the heroes and heroines who navigate between them, and the cosmological events that shape the world as it is, were preserved and transmitted through the Elanco, the Yakutian heroic epic that we mentioned briefly in the previous section in the context of its psychological functions during the long dark winter. The Elanco is a literary tradition of extraordinary richness and scale. Individual epics can run to tens of thousands of lines, performed from memory by specialist singers called Olankosits over sessions that might extend across multiple nights. The heroes of the Elanco are Iar Toyin and his kin, celestial beings in human form who embody the Saka ideal of physical strength, moral courage, generosity, and right relationship with both the human and spirit worlds. Their adventures, battles with the forces of the lower world, quests for brides across cosmic distances, negotiations with spirits of every kind, encode the Saka cosmological understanding in narrative form, making it accessible, memorable, and emotionally engaging in ways that direct theological exposition never could. UNESCO recognized the Elanco as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2005, one of the most prestigious acknowledgments available in the global system for the recognition and protection of living cultural traditions. The recognition was both an honor and, in a sense, an acknowledgement of vulnerability. Traditions recognized as intangible heritage are typically traditions that face genuine risks of loss, and the Elanco tradition was by the early 21st century sustained by a relatively small number of practicing Olankosits, many of them elderly, in a cultural landscape where younger generations had competing claims on their attention and where the conditions, the long winter nights, the communal gathering, the shared cosmological framework, that had originally sustained the tradition had been significantly altered by modernization. The response has been an active and energetic program of revival and documentation, including the establishment of performance schools, recording projects, and educational programs aimed at transmitting the tradition to a new generation of practitioners, with results that are encouraging without being entirely reassuring. The spiritual life of Yakutia, then, is not a relic of the past, preserved in amber like the ancient insects that are occasionally found in the fossilized resin of Siberian forests. It is a living tradition, changed, challenged, partially disrupted by the upheavals of the Russian imperial and Soviet periods, actively revived and renegotiated in the post-Soviet context, and still deeply present in the cultural identity and daily life of the Saka people in ways that outsiders sometimes find surprising. The shamanic traditions, suppressed vigorously during the Soviet period, shamans were arrested, their drums destroyed, their practices driven underground with a thoroughness that reflected the genuine threat that Soviet authorities perceived in a cosmological system so fundamentally incompatible with materialist ideology, survived in attenuated and transformed forms and have experienced a significant revival since the 1990s. New shamans have been initiated. Old knowledge has been recovered from the memories of elders and from the ethnographic records made, often with ambivalent intentions, by Soviet-era researchers. The drums are being made again, the songs are being sung, and in the long dark of a Yakutian winter night, the fire still crackles, the world still seems thin at its edges, and the relationship between the human community and the more-than-human world it inhabits still feels like something worth tending with care. You have traveled a long way tonight, across millennia of human migration, through the accumulated ingenuity of clothing and food and architecture, through the physiology of cold and the cosmology of darkness, and now you arrive, gently and without fanfare, at the present day. The Saka Republic of the 21st century is a place of startling contradictions, a place where a woman in a traditional fur coat checks her smartphone for the weather forecast before stepping out into -40, where a young man live-streams his stroganina preparation to followers in Tokyo and Sao Paulo, where Soviet-era apartment blocks lean at unsettling angles on thawing permafrost while the regional government debates billion-dollar infrastructure investment strategies. It is a place simultaneously ancient and urgently contemporary, and the tensions and energies generated by that simultaneity are some of the most interesting and consequential stories emerging from any region on Earth right now. Begin with the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely extraordinary. The Saka Republic covers over 3 million square kilometers but contains a population of only around 1 million people. a population density so low that if the territory were a country, it would be among the most sparsely populated on Earth. Of that population, the Sakha themselves constitute roughly half, with Russians, Ukrainians, and other Slavic groups making up much of the remainder, along with smaller populations of Evenki, even Yukagir, and other indigenous groups whose ancestral relationship with the land predates the Sakha arrival by centuries or millennia. Yakutsk, the capital, contains roughly a third of the entire republic's population, a degree of urban concentration that reflects both the economic logic of a resource extraction economy and the sheer logistical difficulty of sustaining dispersed settlements in conditions of such extreme remoteness and climate severity. The economy of the Sakha Republic is dominated, to a degree that creates both wealth and vulnerability, by natural resource extraction. The Republic sits atop mineral deposits of staggering richness: diamonds, gold, coal, natural gas, and oil in quantities that have made it one of the most economically significant regions in the Russian Federation and one of the most closely watched resource frontiers in the global economy. The diamond deposits of Yakutia are among the largest in the world, and the mining company Alrosa, majority owned by the Russian state and the Republic itself, is one of the largest diamond producers on the planet, responsible for a substantial fraction of global diamond supply. The implications of this wealth for the Sakha Republic are complex and contested. Resource revenues fund regional infrastructure and social services at levels that would be impossible without them, but the environmental costs of large-scale mining in a fragile subarctic ecosystem are significant, and the question of how equitably the benefits of resource extraction are distributed among the Republic's population, and particularly among its indigenous communities, is one that generates ongoing political tension and scholarly debate. The infrastructure of modern Yakutia is a study in the logistics of extreme remoteness. Yakutsk, the largest city built on permafrost, is not connected to the rest of Russia's road network by a paved all-season highway, a fact that continues to astonish people when they first encounter it. The only land route from Yakutsk to the broader Russian road system is the Kolyma Highway, known informally and with some justification as the Road of Bones, a name that references the prisoners of the Soviet Gulag system whose forced labor built it and whose bodies, according to persistent historical accounts, were in some places incorporated into the roadbed itself. This road is unpaved, seasonal in its usability, and an adventure of the most demanding kind even for experienced off-road travelers with appropriate vehicles. The Lena River, as we noted early in tonight's journey, serves as a highway in winter when frozen, but during the spring thaw and autumn freeze-up there are periods of weeks when neither the river ice nor the river itself is reliably navigable, and the city is accessible primarily by air, a situation that makes the cost of goods in Yakutsk dramatically higher than in comparable Russian cities connected to the national transport network, and that creates logistical challenges of impressive complexity for everything from food supply to medical evacuation. A bridge across the Lena River at Yakutsk has been discussed, planned, and argued about for decades. It would be a major engineering achievement and a transformative piece of infrastructure for the entire region. But the cost, the technical challenges of building a major bridge on permafrost, and the political and economic complexities of Russian federal infrastructure investment have kept it in the planning stage for so long that Yakutsk residents have developed a weary humor about it. The bridge is coming, locals say, with the tone of people who have been told this many times. It is always coming. Someday, perhaps, it will actually arrive. The educational and cultural institutions of Yakutsk would surprise visitors who expect a remote Siberian city to be culturally sparse. The Northeastern Federal University is a substantial research and teaching institution with particular strengths in permafrost science, Arctic ecology, indigenous language documentation, and the various applied sciences relevant to subarctic conditions. The Sakha National Theater performs both classical Russian repertoire and Sakha language productions, including modern interpretations of the Elanco tradition that bring the ancient epic form into dialogue with contemporary theatrical aesthetics. The Mammoth Museum, housing an extraordinary collection of permafrost-preserved paleontological specimens, including some of the most complete and remarkable mammoth remains ever recovered, is a genuinely world-class scientific and cultural institution that draws researchers from across the globe and that connects the deep prehistoric past of the Yakutian landscape to the scientific present in ways that are constantly generating new discoveries and new questions. The mammoth, indeed, has become something of an emblem for the Sakha Republic in the contemporary period, a symbol of the deep time and extraordinary preservation qualities of the permafrost landscape that also increasingly carries a more ambivalent charge. Because the permafrost that has preserved the mammoths so perfectly for tens of thousands of years is thawing. Not quickly by geological standards, but at a rate that is measurable, accelerating, and deeply consequential for everything from individual buildings to global climate systems. The permafrost of the Sakha Republic contains enormous quantities of organic carbon, the partially decomposed remains of plants and animals accumulated over thousands of years of Arctic and subarctic ecosystem productivity, locked in the frozen ground and prevented from further decomposition by the cold. As the permafrost thaws, this organic material becomes available to microbial decomposition, releasing carbon dioxide and methane, both potent greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere in quantities that could, at sufficient scale, create a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which permafrost thaw drives warming that drives further permafrost thaw. This is not a hypothetical or distant concern. It is happening now, and the Sakha Republic is one of the places where it is most visibly and consequentially happening. The physical evidence of permafrost thaw in Yakutia is visible across the landscape in multiple forms, some of them dramatic and some of them quietly insidious. Thermokarst, the irregular, hummocky terrain created when permafrost thaws unevenly beneath the surface, causing the ground to subside in some areas while remaining elevated in others, is spreading across landscapes that were stable within living memory. Lakes that formed in thermokarst depressions, thermokarst lakes, are expanding and in some cases draining suddenly as the permafrost beneath them fails, releasing their contents into the broader drainage system in events that can dramatically reshape the local landscape within hours. Forests are being undermined, with trees losing their footing in the destabilized active layer and tilting at odd angles in formations that ecologists call drunken forests, a term that captures both the visual impression and a certain grim whimsy about the situation. Coastlines along the Arctic Ocean shore of the Republic are eroding at rates of several meters per year in some locations as the permafrost bluffs that form the coast thaw and slump into the sea, releasing their ancient carbon and in some cases exposing mammoth remains that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years, briefly, poignantly visible before they too are carried away by the sea. For the communities of the Sakha Republic, these physical changes are not abstract environmental statistics but immediate, practical disruptions to ways of life that have been sustainable for generations. The winter roads built on frozen rivers are becoming shorter in their safe operating season, some of them now reliable for weeks fewer per year than they were a generation ago, with cascading consequences for the supply of goods to remote communities that depend on them. Hunting and fishing patterns that have been refined over centuries are being disrupted as the distribution of fish and game responds to changing temperatures and altered habitat conditions. The reindeer herding traditions of the Evenki and even communities are facing new pressures as the landscape they have navigated for generations changes in ways that accumulated traditional knowledge does not always adequately anticipate. Permafrost thaw is destabilizing buildings, roads, runways, and pipelines across the Republic, creating infrastructure maintenance challenges of escalating cost and complexity. The engineering knowledge developed over decades for building on stable permafrost is having to be rapidly revised for building on permafrost whose thermal state is no longer reliably predictable. The Sakha Republic scientists are at the forefront of global permafrost research, and the institutions of Yakutsk have been monitoring permafrost temperatures, active layer depths, and related parameters for longer than almost any comparable institutions anywhere in the world. The data they have accumulated represents an irreplaceable record of permafrost dynamics over the period of most rapid anthropogenic climate change, and their research is informing global climate models and policy discussions in ways that give the Sakha Republic an international scientific significance entirely disproportionate to its population size. There is a particular irony, not lost on the scientists involved, in the fact that a region whose economy is substantially built on the extraction and export of fossil fuels is also one of the world's leading centers of research into the consequences of burning those fuels. It is the kind of irony that the 21st century specializes in generating, and it does not have an easy resolution. The cultural dimensions of contemporary Yakutian life are, against this backdrop of environmental and economic challenge, remarkably vital. The Sakha language, a Turkic language with a complex vowel harmony system, a rich traditional vocabulary, and a literary tradition now extending into modern fiction, poetry, and journalism, has a healthier status than many minority languages in comparable situations, partly because of sustained government support for Saka language education and media in the post-Soviet period, and partly because of the strong cultural identity politics that have made language maintenance a matter of community pride and political assertion rather than mere sentiment. Saka language films have attracted international attention at film festivals, with directors exploring themes of traditional life, shamanic spirituality, and the tensions of modernity in visual styles that draw on both international cinematic traditions and specifically Yakutian aesthetic sensibilities. The Yakutian film industry, affectionately nicknamed Sakawood by its admirers, has produced work of genuine artistic distinction that has introduced the landscapes and stories of this remote republic to audiences around the world who would otherwise have had no occasion to encounter them. The revival of traditional practices, shamanism, Alanko performance, traditional crafts, the Isiaq Festival, continues with energy and genuine popular enthusiasm, particularly among younger Saka who find in these traditions a source of identity and meaning that the homogenizing pressures of global culture do not provide. The Isiaq Festival, celebrated each June around the summer solstice, now draws tens of thousands of participants to the main celebration near Yakutsk, with the Great Ohuokai Circle Dance, participants in traditional dress moving together on the summer grass under the barely setting sun, constituting one of the most visually spectacular and emotionally powerful cultural events in the entire Russian Federation. It is a celebration of survival, of continuity, of the stubborn persistence of a people and a culture that have endured ice ages and empire, collectivization and cultural suppression, and that stand now, in the early 21st century, facing a new and different kind of challenge, the warming of the world that gave them their identity, with the same combination of practical ingenuity, cultural depth, and quietly defiant resilience that has always been their most essential characteristic. The young woman stepping out into -40 to check her smartphone, and the elder who still knows the names of every spirit associated with every bend of the local river are not in contradiction. They are the same culture at different points of its continuous adaptation, adapting now, as it has always adapted, to conditions that change while the essential human need for meaning, community, beauty, and survival remains constant. The cold that shaped this culture over thousands of years is paradoxically retreating, and the people it shaped must now navigate a world that is becoming, in this one respect, slightly less like the world their ancestors mastered, without losing the mastery that the cold taught them. That is perhaps the most remarkable challenge in a history that has never been short of remarkable challenges. And so the story of Yakutia does not end. It continues, as it always has, in the space between the fire and the dark, between what is known and what is coming, between the deep past preserved in the permafrost and the uncertain future that the thawing of that permafrost represents. It continues in the hands of the clothing makers and the builders and the fishermen and the scientists and the singers. It continues in the great circle of the Ohuokai, turning slowly under the midnight sun. It continues in the cold itself, still formidable, still defining, still the central fact of existence in one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. And now, as the story finds its resting place, it is time to let the night do what nights are for. Feel the weight of everything you have learned tonight settling gently over you, like the first snowfall of a Yakutian autumn, quiet, unhurried, covering everything in a soft and even white. The temperatures we have been speaking of, the -70s and -50s that define so much of what you encountered tonight, feel very far away now, as they should. You are warm. You are safe. The blanket around you is doing exactly what those extraordinary Yakutian fur coats were designed to do, holding your warmth close, keeping the cold at bay, making a small, perfect climate of comfort in the middle of whatever the world outside is doing. Let your breathing slow down now. There is nothing you need to do. The Lena River is frozen far to the north, its ice many meters thick and utterly still, and the aurora is perhaps moving above it in colors that no one awake tonight will remember precisely tomorrow. The stars over Oymyakon are cold and clear and impossibly far away. The Yakutian horse is standing in a snow-covered field somewhere, warm beneath its impossible coat, entirely unbothered. The permafrost is doing what permafrost does in the deep of winter, holding still, holding cold, holding the ancient world in its long, frozen embrace. And you are here, in your warm room, in your comfortable bed, at whatever hour this finds you, and the knowledge of what human beings are capable of, the ingenuity and the beauty and the sheer stubborn refusal to be defeated that you have traveled through tonight can settle into you now not as information but as something quieter and more sustaining. A reminder, a reassurance, that people have always found ways, that the cold has always, eventually, been answered by warmth, that the dark has always, in its time, given way to light. Let your eyes close, let the story hold you, let the soft hum of the world carry you the rest of the way into sleep. You are warm, you are held, and tonight, in your dreaming, the aurora might just find you.